Alright, buckle up, folks, because we're about to dive into some seriously dark stuff. When people think about ancient Rome, they usually picture gladiators, togas, and maybe some fancy architecture. But let me tell you, the reality was way more twisted than Hollywood makes it seem. The Roman Empire had its fair share of absolute psychopaths sitting on the throne, and today we're ranking the top 5 most violent, cruel, and downright unhinged emperors who ever wore the purple. Now, before we start this nightmare parade, let's get one thing straight. Being a Roman emperor wasn't exactly a job for the faint of heart. These guys ruled over millions of people across 3 continents, commanded massive armies, and had the power of life and death over pretty much everyone. But even by ancient standards, these 5 dudes took cruelty to a whole new level. We're going countdown style here, starting with number 5 and working our way up to the absolute worst of the worst. And trust me, by the time we get to number 1, you'll be wondering how humanity ever survived having these maniacs in charge. So grab a drink, you'll probably need it, and let's take a trip back to ancient Rome. The good, the bad, and the absolutely horrifying. Number 5, Domitian, 81 to 96 CE, the paranoid control freak. Coming in at number 5, we've got Domitian, and this guy was basically what you'd get if you mixed a control freak with someone who had serious trust issues and gave them unlimited power. Not a great combo, as you can imagine. Domitian was the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, and honestly, he started off pretty promising. The dude was actually competent at running the empire. He built some cool stuff, straightened the borders, and even gave the common people some decent entertainment. But here's the thing about absolute power, it has a way of bringing out the absolute worst in people, and Domitian was no exception. About halfway through his reign, something in Domitian's brain just snapped. Maybe it was the stress of the job, maybe it was those assassination plots, real and imagined. But the guy became absolutely obsessed with the idea that everyone was out to get him. And when I say obsessed, I mean he made modern conspiracy theorists look rational. He started seeing enemies everywhere: senators, generals, his own family members, probably the guy who delivered his morning wine. This paranoia turned him into a one-man reign of terror that would make Stalin proud. The Roman Senate, which was supposed to be this prestigious governing body, basically became his personal hit list. And then the reign of terror begins. Domitian's approach to dealing with suspected enemies was pretty straightforward: kill them. All of them. Their families too, just to be safe. He'd execute senators on the flimsiest of pretext. Maybe they looked at him funny during a meeting, or someone overheard them making a joke about his receding hairline. Yeah, the guy was that petty. One of his favorite moves was the whole forced suicide thing. Instead of just having someone executed outright, he'd give them the honor of killing themselves. It was like a twisted Roman version of, you can't fire me, I quit, except, with actual death involved. These forced suicide became so common that being invited to a private meeting with the emperor was basically a death sentence. The senators were so terrified that they stopped speaking up about anything. Senate meetings turned into these weird silent affairs where everyone just nodded along with whatever Domitian wanted, hoping they wouldn't be next on his list. It was like the world's deadliest game of Simon Says. But Domitian wasn't content with just regular old executions. Oh no, this guy had a flair for the dramatic. He'd sometimes have people tortured for information about plots that probably didn't even exist. And we're not talking about a quick interrogation here. Roman torture methods were extensive. One particularly nasty trick he liked was to promise mercy to his enemies and then kill them anyway. He'd have someone brought before him, seemingly forgive them for whatever imaginary crime they'd committed, and then have them murdered on their way home. Talk about mixed messages. He also had this charming habit of executing entire families. Not just the person he suspected of treason, but their spouses, kids, sometimes even household slaves. His logic was that if one member of the family was disloyal, they all probably were. It was like guilt by association taken to its absolute extreme. Domitian created this massive network of spies and informants that would make the Stasi jealous. Romans started turning on each other, reporting neighbors, friends, even family members, for saying anything that could be construed as criticism of the emperor. It was like living in a paranoid nightmare where anyone could be working for the government. These informants were well rewarded too. Turn in a traitor, real or imagined, and you might get their property, their job, maybe even their wife. It created this atmosphere of constant fear and suspicion that poisoned Roman society for years. The crazy thing about Domitian is that he was actually right to be paranoid. People really were plotting against him. But that's because his own actions had created so many enemies that assassination became pretty much inevitable. It's like that old saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. In 96 CE, a group of court officials finally had enough and stabbed him to death in his own palace. The Roman Senate was so relieved that they immediately declared his memory damned, damnatio memoriae, which was basically their way of saying, let's pretend this guy never existed. But here's the thing, even though Domitian was undeniably cruel and paranoid, he doesn't crack our top four. That should give you some idea of just how much worse things are going to get as we continue our countdown. The guy killed hundreds, maybe thousands of people based on nothing more than a suspicion and paranoia. He turned the Roman government into a police state and made everyone live in fear. But compared to our next four emperors, Domitian was practically a Boy Scout. Number 4, Caracalla, 198 to 117 CE, the brother killer with a god complex. Moving up to number 4, we've got Marcus Aurelius Antonius, better known as Caracalla, and oh boy, this dude was a piece of work. If Domitian was paranoid, Caracalla was just straight up unhinged. We're talking about an emperor who killed his own brother and then tried to convince everyone it was totally justified because the gods told him to do so. Caracalla's story is particularly messed up because it involves some serious family drama. This wasn't just political violence, this was personal, twisted, and absolutely brutal, even by Roman standards. The whole mess started when Caracalla's father, Septimus Severus, decided to name both of his sons as co-heirs. Caracalla and his younger brother, Geta, were supposed to rule the empire together after their dad died. Now, if you know literally anything about Roman history, you can probably guess how well this power sharing arrangement worked out. The two brothers hated each other with a passion that was legendary even in ancient Rome. We're talking about a rivalry that made Cain and Abel look like they just had a minor disagreement over who got the bigger piece of cake. These guys couldn't be in the same room without trying to kill each other. Their father knew this was going to be a problem, so on his deathbed, he supposedly told them to work together, enrich the soldiers, and ignore everyone else. Great parenting advice there, Septimus, really setting the boys up for success. After their father died in 211 CE, the two brothers tried the whole co-emperor thing for about a hot minute, but it was obvious to everyone that this arrangement was doomed. The brothers divided the imperial palace down the middle, each with their own guards, their own staff, their own everything. It was like the world's deadliest divorced couple still living in the same house. Finally, Caracalla decided he'd had enough of sharing. In 212 CE, he arranged a meeting with Geta in their mother's apartment, supposedly to work out their differences. Their mum, Julia Domna, was probably thinking this was finally her chance to get her boys to make up and play nice. Instead, Caracalla has his guards murder Geta right there in their mother's arms. And we're not talking about a quick, clean assassination here. According to the historical accounts, Geta was literally clinging to his mother when Caracalla's men hacked him to pieces. Julia Domna ended up covered in her younger son's blood, traumatized beyond belief. But wait, it gets worse. After murdering his brother, Caracalla went completely off the rails. He ordered the execution of anyone who had supported Geta, anyone who had been friends with Geta, anyone who had ever said anything nice about Geta, basically everyone who might have been even slightly upset about the whole brother murder situation. This wasn't just a few political enemies we're talking about. Caracalla had thousands of people killed: senators, soldiers, court officials, random citizens. If you had any connection to Geta whatsoever, you were probably dead. Some estimates put the death toll at around 20,000 people. 20,000 for supporting the wrong brother in a family feud. The purge was so extensive that it basically crippled the Roman government. Caracalla wiped out the entire departments, killed experienced administrators and generals, and left the empire in chaos. But he didn't care. In his twisted mind, anyone who hadn't immediately supported him was a traitor who deserved to die. Now, here's where things get really weird. After all this killing, Caracalla started claiming that he was actually a god. Not just divinely blessed or chosen by the gods, he literally thought he was a deity. Specifically, he became obsessed with Alexander the Great and started claiming that he was Alexander reincarnated. This wasn't just a harmless delusion. Caracalla started demanding that people worship him as a living god. He built temples to himself, commissioned statues showing him with the divine attributes, and expected everyone to treat him like he was literally immortal. Anyone who didn't play along with this fantasy risked becoming another victim of his paranoid rage. Over a few positive things, Caracalla is remembered for his construction of the massive public baths in Rome that still bear his name today. The baths of Caracalla were genuinely impressive, a huge complex with hot and cold pools, exercise areas, libraries, you name it. They were like an ancient Roman mega mall crossed with a luxury spa. But here's the twisted part. These baths were largely funded by the property seized from all the people Caracalla had executed. Every time you murdered someone for treason, you got to confiscate their wealth. So the baths of Caracalla were literally built with blood money, paid for by the liquidated assets of thousands of victims. It's a perfect example of how Roman emperors could create beautiful, lasting monuments while simultaneously being complete monsters. The baths were genuinely beneficial to the Roman people, but they came at the cost of thousands of lives. Caracalla spent the later years of his reign leading military campaigns, partly because he genuinely enjoyed warfare and partly because it gave him more opportunities to kill people. He was particularly brutal in his campaigns in Germany and Scotland, where he allegedly ordered the massacre of entire tribes. During his campaign in Scotland, he invited a bunch of Caledonian chefs to peace negotiations, then had them all murdered when they showed up unarmed. It was treachery on a massive scale, and it showed that Caracalla's violence wasn't limited to political enemies. He was perfectly happy to commit genocide if it served his purposes. One of the most historically significant things that Caracalla did was issue the Antonine Constitution in 212 CE, which granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. Now, this might sound like a progressive humanitarian move, and some historians do give him credit for it. But the reality is that Caracalla probably did this for purely financial reasons. Roman citizens had to pay more taxes than non citizens. So, by making everyone a citizen, he massively increased the empire's tax revenue. He needed the money to pay for his expensive military campaigns and his lavish lifestyle. So even when Caracalla did something that looks good on paper, his motivations were typically selfish and cynical. Caracalla's reign of terror finally ended in 217 CE when he was assassinated by his own guards during a military campaign in Mesopotamia. According to the historical accounts, he was literally taking a bathroom break on the side of the road when one of his bodyguards stabbed him to death. It's almost poetic justice. A man who had betrayed and murdered so many people was himself betrayed and murdered by someone he trusted. The Roman army didn't even bother to pursue his killers very seriously. They were probably just relieved that the madman was finally dead. And why is he only number 4? So, don't get me wrong, this guy was absolutely brutal. He killed his own brother in their mother's arms, murdered thousands of innocent people, and ruled throughout terror and violence. But compared to our top 3, his cruelty was at least somewhat focused. Most of Caracalla's violence was directed at specific political enemies or military targets. He didn't torture people for entertainment or invent elaborate new ways to cause suffering just for fun. His violence, while extreme, usually had some kind of twisted logic behind it. Our top 3 emperors, on the other hand, took cruelty to an entirely different level. They didn't just kill their enemies, they made art of human suffering. They turned torture and murder into entertainment, and they seemed to genuinely enjoy causing pain. Caracalla was a brutal, paranoid, megalomaniacal killer, but he wasn't creative about it. And in the world of truly monstrous Roman emperors, a lack of creativity in your cruelty actually keeps you out of the top 3. Trust me, it's about to get much, much worse. Number 3, Commodus. 177-192 CE, the Gladiator emperor who lost his mind. All right, we've reached number 3, and this is where things start getting seriously twisted. Meet Commodus, the emperor who thought he was a gladiator, believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules, and turned the Roman Empire into his personal playground of violence and depravity. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, you already know a bit about this guy. He's the main villain, played by Joaquin Phoenix in the older movie. But let me tell you, the real Commodus was so much worse than anything Hollywood could show you. We're talking about an emperor who was so completely detached from reality that he made Caracalla look reasonable. The really tragic thing about Commodus is that he started off with every possible advantage. His father was Marcus Aurelius, literally one of the greatest emperors in Roman history. The guy who wrote the Meditations, a Stoic philosopher and a genuinely decent human being who cared about justice and the welfare of his people. Marcus Aurelius spent years preparing Commodus to rule, giving him the best education money could buy, exposing him to philosophy and statecraft, and trying to instill in him the values of a good emperor. But somewhere along the way, something went horribly, catastrophically wrong. Maybe it was the pressure of living up to such an incredible father. Maybe it was the corrupting influence of absolute power. Or maybe Commodus was just born broken. Whatever the case, by the time he took the throne in 180 CE, he was already showing signs of being completely unfit to rule. One of the first signs that Commodus was losing his grip on reality was his growing obsession with Hercules. And I don't mean he just thought Hercules was cool. The dude genuinely believed he was the living reincarnation of the mythical hero. Commodus started commissioning statues and paintings of himself dressed as Hercules, complete with the lion skin and club. He would walk around the palace in these ridiculous costumes, demanding that everyone address him as Hercules. Court officials had to keep straight faces while their emperor paraded around dressed like he was heading to a toga party. But it wasn't just cosplay. Commodus genuinely believed that he had Hercules' strength and divine nature. He started claiming that he could perform miraculous feats and that he was destined for greatness, and the gods spoke to him directly. It was like watching someone have a complete psychological breakdown in real time, except that someone controlled the most powerful empire in the world. Now, here's where things get really messed up. Most Roman emperors watched gladiator games from the safety of the imperial box, surrounded by guards and dignitaries. But not our boy Commodus. This lunatic actually wanted to fight in the arena himself. At first, his advisors probably thought this was just a phase. Rich Romans sometimes liked to play at being gladiators in private schools, sort of like how modern billionaires might take up boxing or martial arts as a hobby. But Commodus took it way, way too far. He started appearing in the Colosseum as an actual gladiator, fighting against wild animals and human opponents. Now, you might be thinking, well, at least he was brave enough to put himself in danger. But here's the thing, these fights were completely rigged. Commodus's gladiator appearances were basically elaborate theatrical productions designed to make him look like an invincible hero. His human opponents were given wooden swords, while he had real weapons. The wild animals were often drugged, wounded, or chained before he fought them. Sometimes his enemies were actually criminals who had been specifically instructed to lose. The emperor would stride into arena, defeat those predetermined opponents, and then bask in the applause of a crowd that was basically forced to cheer. It was like watching a grown man beat up a bunch of kindergarteners and then celebrate like he just won the Olympics. But the really sick part was what happened when things didn't go according to script. If an opponent fought too well, or if an animal proved more dangerous than expected, Commodus would have his guards intervene. He once killed an ostrich in the arena and then walked over to the senatorial section holding the bird's severed head, making threatening gestures that basically said, "This could be you next." While Commodus was playing dress up and fighting rigged gladiator matches, the actual business of running the empire was falling apart. But instead of addressing real problems like border security, economic issues, or administrative corruption, Commodus was more interested in eliminating anyone who might threaten his fantasy world. He started having senators executed for the crime of not being enthusiastic enough about his gladiator performances. If you didn't cheer loud enough when the emperor heroically defeated a drugged lion, you might find yourself charged with treason. The Roman Senate, which had been the cornerstone of Roman government for centuries, became a group of terrified yes men who spent their time trying to figure out how to praise the emperor's latest arena stunt. The purges weren't limited to senators either. Commodus had generals, governors, and court officials killed on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. Unlike Caracalla, who at least killed people for semi-rational political reasons, Commodus seemed to kill people almost randomly based on paranoid delusions and petty grudges. This is where Commodus really starts to distinguish himself from our previous entries. While Domitian and Caracalla were brutal, their cruelty usually served some kind of political purpose. Commodus, on the other hand, seemed to genuinely enjoy causing suffering. He would sometimes force senators to fight in the arena as gladiators, not as a form of execution, but as entertainment. Picture this: respected elder statesmen who had spent their lives in service to Rome, forced to dress up in gladiator costumes and fight each other while the emperor laughed and cheered. One particularly twisted game Commodus liked was to gather a bunch of disabled people, amputees, people with physical deformities, anyone who couldn't defend themselves properly, and then fight them in the arena while pretending they were mythological monsters. He would dress them up in costumes and have them chase him around while he heroically defeated them with his sword. While Commodus was indulging in his sick fantasies, the Roman economy was going to hell. The emperor was spending ridiculous amounts of money on his games, his costumes, his rigged gladiator matches, and his general debauchery. The imperial treasury, which Marcus Aurelius had carefully maintained, was being drained to fund one man's psychological breakdown. To make up for the shortfall, Commodus started seizing property from the wealthy Romans on trumped up charges. He would accuse someone of treason, have them executed, and then confiscate their wealth. It was like a twisted version of a fundraising campaign, except instead of selling cookies, he was murdering people and stealing their stuff. The provinces were also being squeezed to fund Commodus's lifestyle. Taxes were raised, corruption became rampant, and local officials started abusing their power because they knew the emperor didn't care about good governance. He was too busy playing gladiator. As if all this wasn't crazy enough, Commodus decided that Rome itself needed to be renamed in his honor. He declared that the city would now be called Commodiana, the Roman people would be called Commodians, and even the months of the year would be renamed after his various titles and achievements. January becomes Amazonius after his supposed prowess as a warrior. February became Invictus, the Unconquerable, and so on. It was like living in a country where a megalomaniac had been given absolute power over the calendar. Imagine having to write dates like the 15th of Hercules and the year of Commodus the Divine. He also started referring to himself as the Roman Hercules in official documents and demanded that all the statues of the actual Hercules be modified to look like him instead. It was narcissism taken to such an extreme that it becomes almost incomprehensible. Toward the end of the reign, Commodus's behavior became so erratic that even his closest supporters started to worry. He announced that he planned to move the capital of the empire from Rome to some city he would build and name after himself. He talked about abolishing the Senate entirely and ruling as a god king with no earthly constraints. Most disturbing of all, he started making plans to appear in the arena on January the 1st, 193 CE, not as gladiator, but as a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. He wanted to take his oath to office while dressed as a gladiator, surrounded by his fellow fighters rather than senators and dignitaries. This was basically the final straw for the people around him. The idea of the Roman Empire being officially governed by someone who thought he was a gladiator god was too much even for Commodus's enablers. On New Year's Eve, 192 CE, a group of conspirators, including his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain, and the praetorian prefect, decided they'd had enough. They tried to poison him first, but when that didn't work fast enough, they sent in a professional wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. The irony is perfect. An emperor who was obsessed with physical combat and thought he was invincible was killed by an actual athlete in hand-to-hand combat. After 12 years of terrorizing the Roman world while playing dress-up, Commodus was finally defeated by someone who didn't have to pretend to be strong. So why does Commodus rank at number 3 instead of higher? This guy was clearly insane. brutal, and caused enormous damage to the Roman Empire, but there is something almost pathetic about his cruelty. Most of Commodus's worst behavior came from his complete detachment from reality. He wasn't coldly calculating in his violence the way our top two emperors were. He was more like a spoiled child with godlike power, lashing out at anyone who didn't play along with his fantasies. Don't get me wrong, the people he killed were just as dead, and the suffering he caused was very real, but there was something almost accidental about much of his cruelty. He was so caught up in his own delusions that he seemed genuinely surprised when people didn't appreciate being forced to participate in his sick games. Our top two emperors, on the other hand, knew exactly what they were doing. They were creative, deliberate, and systematic in their cruelty. They didn't just stumble into violence because of mental illness, they embraced it as an art form. Commodus was a madman who happened to be emperor. Our next two entries were emperors who chose to be madmen. Number 2, Caligula, 37 to 41 CE, the monster in purple. Welcome to number 2 on our countdown of history's most violent Roman emperors, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula. And folks, this is where we dive headfirst into the truly nightmarish stuff. If Commodus was a madman who happened to be emperor, Caligula was pure, concentrated evil wearing a crown. We're talking about a guy who declared war on Neptune, made his horse a consul, and turned torture into a spectator sport. Caligula didn't just kill people, he made murder into entertainment, cruelty into art, and suffering into a form of public theater. This dude was so twisted that even the other Romans, who weren't exactly squeamish about violence, were horrified by what he did. The really messed up thing about Caligula is that he started off as Rome's golden boy. His father, Germanicus, was a war hero beloved by the Roman people. His great great grandfather was Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The kid had the best bloodline in the empire and was seen as the future of Rome. When Caligula was little, he used to hang out with his father's legions on military campaigns. The soldiers loved this cute kid running around in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny military boots. That's actually where his nickname came from. Caligula means little boot in Latin. It was supposed to be endearing. But then tragedy struck. His father died under mysterious circumstances when Caligula was just 7 years old. Many people suspected that Tiberius, the emperor at the time, had Germanicus poisoned because he saw him as a threat. Whether that's true or not, Caligula grew up believing that his beloved father has been murdered by the imperial family. What followed was basically a childhood designed to create a monster. Tiberius brought young Caligula to live on the island of Capri, which sounds nice until you realize that Capri was where Tiberius had retreated to indulge in his own twisted appetites. The island was essentially a prison paradise where Tiberius surrounded himself with PDF files, sadists, and every kind of sexual deviant you can imagine. Little Caligula spent his formative years watching orgies, torture sessions, and executions. He saw people thrown off cliffs for entertainment, watched prisoners to be slowly tortured to death, and learned that absolute power meant absolute freedom to hurt other people. By the time Caligula was a teenager, he had been thoroughly corrupted by this environment, but he was also smart enough to hide his true nature. Around Tiberius and the other adults, he played the role of the innocent, grieving son. He learned to smile when plotting revenge, to appear harmless when planning violence. When Tiberius died in 37 CE and Caligula became emperor at age 24, the Roman people were ecstatic. Finally, they thought they had a young, charismatic emperor from the beloved Germanicus family. Caligula's first few months in power seemed to confirm their hopes. He recalled political exiles, gave bonuses to the military, put on spectacular games for the people, and generally acted like the kind of generous popular emperor Rome needed. For a brief moment, it looked like the empire had lucked out with a genuinely good ruler. But this was all an act. Caligula was just testing his power, figuring out how much he could get away with. He was like a serial killer who starts out by being the perfect neighbor before revealing his true nature. The honeymoon period lasted about 6 months, and then all hell broke loose. The exact moment when Caligula dropped his mask and revealed his true self is hard to pinpoint, but most historians agree it happened sometime in late 37 or early 38 CE. Maybe it was the stress of imperial responsibility, maybe it was a mental breakdown, or maybe he just got tired of pretending to be human. Whatever the trigger, the change was dramatic and terrifying. Suddenly, the generous young emperor became a paranoid, sadistic monster who seemed to view the entire Roman Empire as his personal torture chamber. And unlike Commodus, who was delusional but somewhat haphazard in his cruelty, Caligula was methodical, creative, and absolutely deliberate in the suffering he caused. This is where Caligula regularly distinguished himself from every other emperor on our list. The guy didn't just kill people, he made murder into performance art. He would spend hours planning elaborate executions, designing new forms of torture, and finding ways to maximize both physical pain and psychological terror. One of his favorite tricks was to invite people to dinner and then force them to watch while he tortured and killed their family members. Imagine being a Roman senator, sitting down for what you thought was going to be a normal meal with the emperor, only to have guards dragging your wife and children. Then you'd have to sit there continuing to eat and make polite conversation while Caligula slowly murdered your loved ones in front of you. But here's the truly sick part. If you showed any emotion, if you cried or begged or tried to intervene, Caligula would have you killed too. The only way to maybe possibly survive was to keep eating your dinner and pretend that watching your family being tortured was just normal dinner entertainment. Caligula took the traditional Roman gladiator games and turned them into something that would make the writers of Saw feel sick. He would pack the Colosseum with spectators and then put on shows that were designed not to entertain but to terrorize. He would force senators to fight with wild animals while dressed in ridiculous costumes. He He'd have political enemies torn apart by lions while making their families watch from the imperial box. He once had an entire section of the crowd thrown to the animals because he was bored and thought it would be amusing. But the really twisted part was how he'd narrate those horrors like they were normal entertainment. He'd provide commentary on the performance, make jokes about the victim's suffering, and encourage the crowd to cheer for particularly creative deaths. It was like being forced to watch a snuff film with the psychopathic host providing color commentary. Physical torture was just one part of Caligula's repertoire. The guy was also a master of psychological warfare, who seemed to understand exactly how to break people's minds. He would grant someone a pardon and then execute them the next day. He'd promise safety to someone's family and then make them watch while those same family members were killed. One of his cruelest tricks was the false hope game. He'd arrest someone on charges of treason, then let them think they were going to be released. He'd have them brought to his chambers, tell them they were forgiven, maybe even share a drink with them. Then, just when they thought they were safe, he'd give a subtle signal to his guards and watch their faces as they realized they were about to die after all. Caligula seemed to feed off the exact moment when hope turned to despair. He'd study his victims' faces, looking for what precise instant when they understood that their suffering was just the beginning, not ending. Now we're getting into territory that's generally hard to talk about, but it's important to understand the full scope of Caligula's depravity. The guy wasn't just a murderer, he was a serial rapist who used sexual violence as another form of torture. He would rape the wives and daughters of his enemies, then forcing their husbands and fathers to watch. He'd invite married couples to state dinners and then openly assault the women while their husbands sat there, powerless to intervene. Any man who tried to protect his wife would be killed immediately, along with his entire family. But it got worse. Caligula would sometimes marry women just so he could divorce them in the most humiliating way possible. He'd force them through elaborate wedding ceremonies, then have the marriage annulled, while publicly detailing their supposed sexual inadequacies or physical flaws. While Caligula was indulging his sadistic appetites, he was also bankrupting the Roman Empire. Tiberius had left behind a huge treasury surplus, but Caligula burned through it in less than a year with his extravagant games, building projects, and general debauchery. When the money ran out, Caligula's solution was simple: uh, steal more. He'd accuse wealthy Romans of treason, have them killed, and confiscate their property. He invented new taxes on lawsuits, marriages, and prostitution. He even auctioned off gladiators at inflated prices and forced senators to buy them, whether they wanted or not. But the most twisted part was how he'd make people pay for their own torture. He'd charge families for the privilege of watching their relatives be executed. He'd make people buy the weapons that would be used to kill them. It was like running a subscription service for sadism. As his reign continued, Caligula's megalomania reached truly insane levels. He didn't just think he was chosen by gods, he literally believed he was a god himself, equal to Jupiter, Mars, and the rest of the Roman pantheon. He started demanding that people worship him as a living deity. He had temples built in his honor and required daily sacrifices to be made to his divine essence. But unlike other emperors who played up their divine connections for political reasons, Caligula seemed to genuinely believe his own hype. He would dress up as different gods depending on his mood. One day he'd be Neptune, complete with the trident and seashells in his hair. The next day he'd be Mars, strutting around in armor and demanding military honors. When he was feeling particularly grandiose, he'd dress up as Jupiter and sit on a golden throne while demanding that people grovel before his divine majesty. This brings us to one of the most bizarre episodes in Caligula's reign, his war against Neptune, the god of the sea. Apparently, Caligula had planned some kind of military expedition across the English Channel to invade Britain, but when his troops reached the coast and saw the rough waters, they hesitated. Instead of recognizing that crossing dangerous seas in bad weather might not be the best military strategy, Caligula declared that Neptune was personally opposing him and needed to be taught a lesson. He ordered his legions to march into the ocean and attack the waves with their swords. Picture this: thousands of Roman soldiers, the most disciplined military force in the ancient world, standing knee deep in the ocean, stabbing at waves, while their emperor screamed orders from the beach. Then, to commemorate his victory over the sea god, Caligula had his troops collect seashells as spoils of war to bring back to Rome. The whole thing would be hilarious if it wasn't so terrifying. These were real soldiers who were forced to participate in their emperor's delusions or face execution for insubordination. And then there is the most famous example of Caligula's insanity, his beloved horse Incitatus. Now, Romans were generally pretty fond of their horses, and wealthy people often pampered their favorite animals, but Caligula took this to an entirely different level. Incitatus wasn't just a pet, he was treated like a member of the imperial family. The horse had his own palace, complete with furniture, servants, and a staff of attendants. He ate from a golden manger and drank wine from jeweled goblets. Caligula would throw dinner parties where Incitatus was the guest of honor, and everyone had to toast the horse's health. But the really crazy part was when Caligula announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. He was completely serious about this. In his mind, a horse would be more loyal and trustworthy than any human senator. Fortunately for everyone involved, Caligula was assassinated before he could follow through on his plan. But the fact that he was seriously considering making a horse into a government official shows just how completely detached from reality he had become. While he was playing dress up and having conversations with his horse, Caligula was also systematically destroying the dignity of the Roman Senate. Those were supposed to be the elder statesmen of the empire, respected leaders who had spent their lives in public service. Caligula turned them into his personal entertainment. He would force senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, even when they were old or infirm. He'd make them serve as waiters at his parties or dance for his amusement. He once made the entire Senate worship his horse and declare it divine. But the psychological torture was even worse than the physical humiliation. Caligula would randomly select senators for execution, sometimes choosing them by lottery just to watch the terror in their eyes. He'd announce that he was going to kill someone's entire family, then change his mind in the last second, then change it back again, keeping his victims in a constant state of panic. One of Caligula's most pointless and expensive projects was the construction of a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, stretching from Bay to Puteoli, a distance of about 3 miles. The engineering was actually pretty impressive. They lashed together ships and covered them with earth to create a roadway across the water. But here's the thing, there was absolutely no practical reasons for this bridge. It didn't connect any important cities or serve any military purpose. Caligula built it for one reason only, so he could fulfill a prophecy that said that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Gulf of Bay. After spending a fortune on this project and forcing thousands of workers to labor around the clock, Caligula rode across his bridge, wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great. Then, apparently satisfied that he had proven the prophecy wrong, he had the entire bridge dismantled. The whole thing was basically the world's most expensive practical joke. By the final year of his reign, Caligula had abandoned any pretense of rational governance and was basically just killing people for fun. He would walk through Rome pointing at random citizens and having them executed on the spot. He'd attend gladiator games and order sections of the crowd to be thrown to the animals because he felt like it. The executions became so common that they lost all meaning. People would wake up in the morning not knowing if they would see sunset. Families would say goodbye to each other every morning because you never knew if the emperor might decide to wipe out your entire household before lunch. One particularly horrific example was when Caligula decided to execute a man whose son had been begging for mercy. Instead of just killing the father quickly, Caligula had the son watch when his father was slowly tortured to death. Then, in a moment of apparent mercy, he invited the son to dinner that same evening. The poor guy showed up, probably thinking the emperor was going to offer some kind of compensation or apology. Instead, Caligula spent the entire meal making jokes about his father's death and asking detailed questions about how it felt to watch his dad die. All of this madness was happening while the Roman economy was collapsing under the weight of Caligula's spending. He had burned through the massive treasury surplus left by Tiberius and was now desperately trying to fund his lifestyle through the increasingly desperate measures. He started selling gladiators to provincial governors at inflated prices, forcing them to buy whether they wanted to or not. He auctioned off the property of executed enemies, sometimes bidding against himself to drive up prices. He even started charging people for the privilege of not being executed, basically running an imperial protection racket. The taxation became so crushing that the entire provinces were being bankrupted. Trade networks collapsed as merchants couldn't afford to do business under Caligula's random levies and confiscations. The empire that had been the envy of the ancient world was being reduced to poverty to fund one man's sadistic fantasies. By 41 CE, Caligula's behavior had become so erratic and dangerous that even his closest supporters were planning his death. He had alienated the Senate, bankrupted the treasury, demoralized the military, and terrorized the population. Everyone understood that something had to be done. The final straw came when Caligula announced his plans to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria and rule as a pharaoh god. He also talked about killing all the senators and replacing them with his horse and a few other animals he considered more trustworthy than humans. On January 24, 41 CE, a group of Praetorian guards cornered Caligula in an underground passage beneath the imperial palace. The leader of the conspiracy was Cassius Charia, an older officer whom Caligula had been humiliating for months by making him use embarrassing passwords and mocking his supposed cowardice. When they finally struck, it was with all the pent up fury of people who had been forced to watch a monster destroy everything they cared about. They didn't just kill Caligula, they stabbed him 30 times, making sure he suffered before he died. Then they hunted down his wife and infant daughter and killed them too, just to make sure his bloodline was completely eliminated. The Roman people's reaction to news of Caligula's death tells you everything you need to know about his reign. There was no mourning, no calls for vengeance against his killers. Instead, there was relief so profound that people literally danced on the streets. After 4 years of living in terror, Rome was finally free. So, why is Caligula not at the top of our list? The guy was clearly a monster who combined systematic cruelty with complete insanity. He turned murder into entertainment, terrorized an entire empire, and seemed to genuinely enjoy causing suffering. The answer is that while Caligula was undoubtedly one of history's most evil individuals, his reign was relatively short. 4 years of absolute horror, but still just 4 years. Our number one emperor managed to sustain his cruelty for much longer, refining it into something even more systematic and devastating. Also, toward the end of his reign, Caligula was clearly insane. His actions became so irrational and self destructive that they were almost random. Our top emperor, on the other hand, maintained a cold, calculating approach to cruelty that made his violence even more effective and terrifying. Caligula was evil and crazy. Our number one was evil and smart. And in the end, that combination proved even more deadly. Number one, Nero, 54 to 68 CE, the artist of atrocity. And here we are, folks, the absolute worst of the worst. the emperor so twisted and cruel that his name became synonymous with evil for the next 2000 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known simply as Nero, the most violent and sadistic emperor in Roman history. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, wasn't Caligula worse? At least Nero is famous for some positive things, like his artistic interests and public work projects. And yeah, that's exactly what makes Nero so terrifying. This wasn't some obvious madman like Caligula or a delusional wannabe gladiator like Commodus. Nero was intelligent, cultured, articulate, and absolutely methodical in his cruelty. We're talking about a guy who could write poetry in the morning, perform on stage in the afternoon, and then spend the evening designing new ways to torture people to death. Nero didn't just kill his enemies, he made suffering into an art form, and he practiced that art for 14 long years. To understand how Nero became such a monster, we need to look at his family background, which was basically a masterclass in how to create a psychopath. His mother was Agrippina the Younger, possibly the most ruthless and ambitious woman in Roman history. His great great grandfather was Augustus, his great grandfather was the war hero Germanicus, and his family tree was basically a who's who of Roman royalty. But here's the thing about Roman imperial families, they were absolutely brutal to each other. Agrippina murdered her way to power, poisoning rivals and arranging accidents for anyone who stood between her and the throne. Little Nero grew up watching his mother manipulate, deceive, and kill, learning that violence was just another tool for getting what you wanted. When Nero was still a child, Agrippina married Emperor Claudius and convinced him to adopt Nero as heir. That meant pushing aside Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, but Agrippina wasn't about to let her family sentiment get in the way of her ambitions. She probably poisoned Claudius when Nero was 16, making her teenage son the most powerful person in the world. For the first few years of Nero's reign, he was basically a puppet controlled by three people: his mother Agrippina, his tutor Seneca, the famous philosopher, and the praetorian prefect Burrus. This triumvirate tried to keep young Nero focused on reasonable policies while they handled the actual business of running the empire. And for a while, it worked pretty well. The early years of Nero's reign were actually quite successful. The economy was strong, the borders were secure, and there were some genuine reforms that helped ordinary Romans. People started talking about a new golden age of peace and prosperity. But even during this period, there were warning signs that something was seriously wrong with the young emperor. He would disappear for days at a time, supposedly studying or practicing his art, but rumors spread about what he was really doing. Servants whispered about strange screams coming from the imperial palace at night, about young slaves who disappeared without explanation, about experiments that Nero conducted in the palace dungeons. The first clear sign that Nero was becoming a monster came in 55 CE when he decided to eliminate his adopted brother Britannicus. Remember, Britannicus was Claudius's biological son and arguably had a better claim to the throne than Nero did. As long as he was alive, he represented a potential threat to Nero's power. Now, a normal emperor might have just exiled Britannicus or found some way to neutralize him politically, but Nero chose a much more direct approach. He had his 14-year-old brother poisoned during a family dinner. The details of this murder are absolutely chilling. Nero's poison expert, a woman named Locusta, had prepared a special toxin that would kill quickly but dramatically. During the meal, Britannicus was served wine that had been treated with that poison. Within minutes, he began convulsing frothing at the mouth and choking on his own blood, while his family watched in horror. But here's the really sick part. Nero sat there calmly eating his dinner while his brother died in agony just a few feet away. When other family members tried to help Britannicus, Nero told them to sit down and finish their meal, claiming that the boy was just having one of his episodes. Britannicus apparently suffered from epilepsy. Afterward, Nero gave a touching speech about how sad he was to lose his beloved brother and how Britannicus's sudden death just showed how fragile life could be. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and it showed that even at age 17, Nero was already an accomplished sociopath. If murdering Britannicus showed that Nero was capable of killing, his treatment of his mother Agrippina proved that he was capable of absolutely anything. This wasn't just political violence, this was the ultimate betrayal, a son murdering the woman who had literally put him on the throne. The relationship between Nero and Agrippina had been getting more and more toxic as the emperor grew older and more independent. Agrippina was used to being the power behind the throne, but Nero was starting to resent her interference. She would criticize his policies, his lifestyle, his artistic pursuits, and his choice of lovers. In her mind, she was just trying to guide her son towards being a good emperor. In Nero's mind, she was an obstacle to be eliminated. But Nero didn't just have Agrippina killed, he turned her murder into an elaborate production that dragged on for months. First, he tried to poison her, but she had built up immunity to most toxins from years of political intrigue. Then he tried to arrange a boating accident, designing a special ship that would collapse and drown her. But Agrippina was a strong swimmer and made it to the shore. Finally, Nero just sent soldiers to her villa with orders to beat her to death. According to the historical accounts, when the soldiers arrived, Agrippina knew exactly why they were there. She reportedly pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here first, for this bore Nero." Even in her final moments, she was trying to make her son feel guilty for what he was doing. Now, here's where Nero gets really twisted. While he was murdering family members and terrorizing the Roman elite, he was also pursuing his artistic interests with fanatical dedication. Nero genuinely believed he was a great poet, musician, and actor, and he expected everyone else to share this delusion. He would force senators to attend his poetry readings, which could go on for hours. These poor guys had to sit there listening to Nero's terrible verse while pretending to be deeply moved by his artistic genius. If you didn't applaud enthusiastically enough, or if you fell asleep during one of his performances, you might find yourself charged with treason. But the really sick part was how Nero would incorporate real violence into his artistic performances. He would stage plays where the death scenes involved actual executions. Criminals condemned to death would be forced to play characters who died on stage, and then they would literally be killed in front of the audience as part of the show. Imagine watching what you think is a normal theatrical performance, only to realize that the actor playing the murder victim is actually being murdered for real. It was like some twisted precursor to snuff films, except it was being performed in respectable theaters for Rome's cultural elite. In 64 CE, a massive fire broke out in Rome that burned for 6 days and destroyed huge portions of the city. Now, there is still debate among historians about whether Nero actually started this fire or just took advantage of it. But what's not in dispute is how he responded to the disaster. While Rome was burning and hundreds of thousands of people were losing their homes, Nero allegedly climbed to the top of the palace and performed his own composition about the fall of Troy, accompanying himself on the lyre. Whether this actually happened or not, the image became so associated with Nero that we still use the phrase fiddling while Rome burns to describe callous indifference to suffering. But the real atrocity came afterward when Nero needed someone to blame for the fire. He chose the Christians, a small religious sect that most Romans didn't understand and were already suspicious of. What followed was one of the most systematic and brutal prosecutions in ancient history. Nero didn't just execute Christians, he turned their deaths into public entertainment. He had them covered in animal skins and uh, torn, torn apart by wild dogs in the arena. He had others crucified and then set on fire to serve as torches for his garden parties. Some were sewn into the skins of wild animals and hunted by trained beasts, while crowds cheered. The historian Tacitus, who was no friend to the Christians, wrote that even Romans who hated the new religion were horrified by Nero's cruelty. People started feeling sorry for the victims because their suffering was so obviously designed to satisfy one man's sadistic pleasures rather than serve any kind of justice. After that fire, Nero used the cleared land to build himself the most extravagant palace complex in Roman history, the Domus Aurea, or House. This wasn't just a residence, it was a monument to megalomania that covered about 200 acres in the heart of Rome. The palace included artificial lakes, forests, vineyards, and even a 120-foot tall bronze statue of Nero himself, dressed as the sun god. The dining rooms had rotating ceilings that would shower guests with flower petals and perfume. The walls were covered in gold leaf and precious stones. It was basically Versailles cranked up to 11. But the Golden House wasn't just about luxury, it was also where Nero indulged in his most twisted appetites. The palace included special rooms designed for torture and murder, soundproof chambers where the emperor could experiment with new forms of cruelty without disturbing his dinner guests. What really sets Nero apart from other emperors is how systematic and organized his cruelty became. While Caligula was impulsive and chaotic in his violence, Nero developed an entire infrastructure for causing suffering. He established a network of informants that made Domitian's spy system look amateur. Romans were encouraged to denounce their neighbors, their family members, even their own spouses for any kind of suspected disloyalty. The for successful denunciations were substantial, while the penalties for refusing to cooperate were severe. Nero also created what were essentially schools for torture, where specialists would develop new techniques for causing pain and extracting information. These weren't just crude beatings. We're talking about sophisticated methods designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The emperor would sometimes personally oversee these sessions, taking notes on which techniques were most effective and suggesting improvements. He approached torture the same way other people might approach cooking or gardening, as a skill to be perfected through practice and study. Nero's treatment of his wives provides another window into his sadistic nature. His first wife, Octavia, was the daughter of Emperor Claudius and had been married to Nero for political reasons when they were both very young. By all accounts, she was a decent person who tried to be a good empress despite being married to a monster. Nero divorced Octavia so he could marry his mistress Poppaea, but that wasn't enough for him. He had Octavia exiled to an island, then had her executed on trumped up charges of adultery. She was only 22 years old when she died, and her only crime was being inconveniently married to a man who wanted to marry someone else. But even Poppaea, whom Nero supposedly loved, wasn't safe from his violence. According to historical accounts, Nero literally kicked her to death while she was pregnant with their second child. The reason? she had complained about him coming home late from the chariot races. Think about that for a moment. Nero murdered his pregnant wife because she had the audacity to be upset that he was spending too much time in sporting events. It's domestic violence taken to an almost incomprehensible extreme. While Nero was indulging his artistic pretensions and sadistic hobbies, the actual business of governing the empire was falling apart. Military campaigns were being bungled, provinces were rebelling, and the imperial finances were in chaos. Nero's response to these problems was typically twisted. Instead of addressing the underlying issues, he would just execute whoever brought him bad news. Generals who lost battles were tortured to death. Provincial governors who couldn't control rebellions were fed to wild animals. Accountants who reported budget shortfalls were crucified. This created a feedback loop where nobody wanted to tell Nero the truth about anything, which meant problems just kept getting worse. The emperor was living in a bubble of delusion, surrounded by people who were too terrified to give him an accurate information about the state of his empire. By 68 CE, Nero's reign of terror had finally pushed the Roman world past its breaking point. Provincial governors in Gaul and Spain declared independence and began marching on Rome. The Praetorian Guard, which was supposed to protect the emperor, started making deals with his enemies. Even the Senate, which had been terrorized into submission for years, began plotting against him. But even as his empire collapsed around him, Nero remained focused on his artistic pursuits. While rebel armies were advancing on Rome, he was planning a grand tour of Greece where he could compete in poetry and music competitions. He seemed genuinely incapable of understanding that people might have legitimate grievances against his rule. When it finally became clear that his situation was hopeless, Nero's reaction was characteristically self-centered. He didn't think about damage he had done to the empire of the people or the people he had hurt. Instead, he complained that the world was losing a great artist, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." In the end, Nero died as he had lived, as a coward and a fraud. When the rebel forces finally reached Rome, he tried to flee the city in disguise, but even his closest supporters had abandoned him, and he ended up hiding in a suburban villa with just a few remaining slaves. As the sound of approaching soldiers grew closer, Nero finally worked up the courage to kill himself. But even then, he couldn't do it cleanly. He spent his final moments practicing different suicide methods, trying to decide which one would be the most dramatic. According to the historical accounts, he kept asking his companions how they thought future generations would remember his death. When he finally pressed a dagger to his throat, he couldn't bring himself to push it on. One of his servants had to help him complete the suicide, essentially committing the final murder of Nero's reign. Nero's 14-year reign left scars on the Roman Empire that never fully healed. He had destroyed the traditional relationship between the emperor and the Senate, shown that absolute power could be used for pure sadism, and demonstrated that even the most civilized society could be ruled by a monster. More than that, Nero had systemized cruelty in a way that influenced tyrants for centuries afterward. His methods of surveillance, torture, and psychological manipulation became a playbook for future dictators. He showed that you could maintain power through terror while simultaneously presenting yourself as a cultured, sophisticated leader. The Christians he persecuted eventually took over the Roman Empire, and they never forgot what he had done to their predecessors. In Christian tradition, Nero became a symbol of the Antichrist, the embodiment of evil ruling the earth. His name became synonymous with persecution and cruelty. So, why does Nero rank as the worst emperor on our list? It's not just the body count, though that was certainly substantial. It's not even just the creative cruelty, though Nero was certainly innovative in his sadism. What makes Nero the absolute worst is the combination of its intelligence, systematic planning, and sheer duration of his reign. Caligula was more obviously insane, but he only ruled for 4 years. Commodus was delusional, but his cruelty was often random and unfocused. Caracalla was brutal, but his violence usually served some kind of political purpose. Nero, on the other hand, was coldly rational in his cruelty. He understood exactly what he was doing, planned his atrocities carefully, and sustained his reign of terror for 14 years. He turned the Roman Empire into a machine designed to produce human suffering, and he operated that machine with the efficiency of a master craftsman. He was also the most hypocritical of our emperors. While the others were at least honest about their violence, Nero presented himself as a patron of the arts, a lover of culture, and a benevolent ruler who cared about his people. He would write beautiful poetry about love and peace in the morning, then spend the afternoon designing new torture devices. This combination of artistic sensitivity and absolute cruelty makes Nero uniquely horrifying. It suggests that culture, education, and artistic talent provide no protection against evil, that a person can appreciate beauty while simultaneously creating ugliness on an industrial scale. And there you have it, folks, the five most violent emperors in Roman history, ranked from bad to absolutely nightmarish. Looking back at this parade of horrors, it's easy to wonder how any of this was possible. How did the most advanced civilization in the ancient world end up being ruled by monsters? Despite their different personalities and methods, all five of these emperors shared some disturbing characteristics. They all came to power young, inheriting more authority than any human being should ever possess. They all grew up in environments where violence was normalized and human life was cheap. And they all discovered that absolute power really does corrupt absolutely. But perhaps most importantly, they all lived in a system that provided no effective checks on imperial authority. The Roman Senate had been neutered, the military was loyal to whoever paid them, and the common people had no real political voice. Once someone like Nero or Caligula gained control, there was no legal way to remove them from power. It's also worth noting that none of these emperors operated in a vacuum. They all had supporters, enablers, and accomplices who helped them carry out their atrocities. For every emperor who ordered a massacre, there were dozens of officials who carried out those orders. For every innovative torture device, there were craftsmen who built it. For every rigged gladiator match, there were crowds who cheered. This collective complicity is perhaps even more disturbing than the individual cruelty of the emperors themselves. It shows how quickly normal people become participants in evil when the incentives are aligned properly and the consequences of resistance are severe enough. The reigns of those five emperors also demonstrate why the founders of modern democracies were so concerned about concentrating too much power in any single person or institution. The Roman Empire had all the trappings of civilization: art, literature, philosophy, advanced technology, sophisticated legal systems, but none of that provided any protection against tyranny. When power is unlimited, and accountability is absent, even the most cultured and intelligent societies can descend into barbarism. The difference between civilization and savagery isn't as large as we'd like to think. So, why do we still talk about these emperors 2000 years later? It's not just morbid fascination, though there's certainly an element of that. These stories serve as warnings about what human nature is capable of under the worst circumstances. They remind us that evil isn't always obvious or cartoonish. Nero wasn't cackling villain from a comic book. He was an intelligent, articulate, culturally sophisticated person, who also happened to be a monster. Caligula could be charming and generous when it suited his purposes. Even Commodus had moments of apparent sanity mixed in with all of his delusions. Perhaps most importantly, remembering these emperors means remembering their victims, the thousands of unnamed people who suffered and died to satisfy the twisted appetites of powerful men. The senators who were forced to watch their families being tortured, the slaves who were fed to wild animals for entertainment, the ordinary citizens who lived in constant fear of arbitrary violence. Their stories matter because they show us what human resilience looks like under the worst possible circumstances. Despite everything these emperors did, Roman civilization survived. People found ways to maintain their humanity even in the face of unhuman cruelty. Love, friendship, art, and hope persisted even in the darkest times. The Roman Empire eventually outlasted all five of these monsters. Domitian was followed by the five good emperors who restored stability and justice. After Caligula's death, Claudius, despite his flaws, brought rational governance back to Rome. Even after Nero's suicide, the empire found new leaders who could rebuild what had been destroyed. This gives us some reason for optimism. Even the worst tyrants are mortal, and even the most damaged societies can recover. The human capacity for evil is real and terrifying, but so is our capacity for resilience, resistance, and renewal. The stories of these five emperors are ultimately stories about the importance of limiting power, maintaining accountability, and never forgetting that civilization is fragile and must be constantly defended. They're reminders that the price of freedom really is eternal vigilance and that we ignore the lessons of history at our own peril. Thanks for taking this dark journey through Roman history with me. I hope you learned something, even if it wasn't always pleasant to hear. And remember, the next time someone complains about modern politics, you can always point out that at least our leaders aren't usually feeding people to lions or declaring war on the ocean. Stay stay safe out there and keep an eye on anyone who starts talking about making their horse a senator. That's never a good sign.